in Kyiv, they are not going to, how can I put it, enjoy a Neville Chamberlain moment just because the Europeans want peace at Ukraine's expense. That's up to the people of Ukraine. And believe me, they have been taking cruise missile and drone attacks by the hundreds every night for 4 years. So nothing is going to break their will. They know where the bomb shelters are. And they also understand the sacrifice of their soldiers on the battlefield. But again, if that means it's relinquishing or surrendering their sovereignty, capitulating to Moscow, this war will go on for several more years.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Malcolm Nance, an intelligence and foreign policy analyst and a former cryptologist in the US Navy. Malcolm, welcome back.
Always good to be here on Times Radio.
Well, it's always good to have you, Malcolm, and I'm keen to get your analysis on the last few days of sort of negotiations and talks around the war in Ukraine. We saw a pretty fervent tirade from Putin in the last couple of days, talking about Russia not trusting the Europeans on the peace process, still trying to claim they want to engage in some sort of negotiations with the US, but at the same time making a pretty big point to say that they will take back what Putin termed historical territories by force or by diplomacy. Now, that term specifically is pretty alarming for those of us that are well versed in Russia's language and especially Putin's language about what he thinks is historical territory of Russia.
Absolutely. And it just doesn't end with Ukraine. He thinks Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are traditional lands that belong to Russia. So for Putin, we clearly see him hardballing a strategy that's based on the American national security policy document, which was released a week ago, which almost could have been written by Putin and his staff, and which predicted long ago. I've written 3 books about this, where the Duginist, Alexander Dugin, his philosopher, was the one to espouse this neo-Eurasianism strategy in which the world would descend and break up into 3 poles, and that it was in Moscow's interest to ensure that Europe was detached from the United States, that the Atlantic Alliance was broken, and that Europe's sphere of influence would fall under Russia, and that the United States would have the Western Hemisphere and China would take the Eastern Hemisphere, and Africa, of course, would be divvied up based on minerals and natural resources. That's happening. It's happening because instead of having a massive 500-page U.S. national security strategy, which delineates precisely where the Defense Department and the administration wants to go and reaffirm its commitments around the world, we got this 31-page, I don't know, drunk university student smoking marijuana at 2 a.m. document in which they outline all of their wishes almost exclusively as if Moscow had written them, where exactly that Europe will be considered a challenger to American dominance and hegemony. America would withdraw mainly from the Atlantic Alliance, including commitments to NATO, and would have some minor issues in the Indo-Pacific region, and then essentially let China run roughshod over Asia. A ridiculous document. Certainly at 31 pages, usually 31 pages was the executive summary of a real document. But Putin understands that. The day after the release of the national security strategy, which had many, many items in it that Putin himself had said, the belief that European was turning away from being a white series of nations and needs to have foreign intervention in its political systems in order to save essentially the white race, because they have immigrants coming in there. And he was speaking specifically to the Turks and the Kurds and Syrians that came to Germany, the French, sub-Saharan Africans who have come and North Africans who have come to France and other countries. Just a racist statement. That is now the official national security document of the United States. It's almost a white supremacist document and literally has nothing to do with defense. This must make Moscow exceptionally happy because it brings to parallel the United States and Russia's worldview. It also espouses that Russia is a dominant player in the world, and despite the fact that it's essentially as John McCain famously said it, a gas station with atomic bombs, a 2-bit gas station with atomic bombs, or as I like to call it, a trailer park with atomic bombs. And, we have more trade with Chile than we have with Russia. Trump wants to change that to bring Russia back to being on par with the United States and then gain access to the hundreds of billions of dollars of frozen sanctioned money. This is essentially a mafia Don's document. All of this being said, Putin now understands his subordinate is acting in his interest. So he can say anything that he wants about Ukraine, and it will come off as being seen as reasonable, no matter how insane it is.
And, a lot of Putin's anger against Europe seems to be over their input to the idea of a Ukraine peace deal. There's been an offer now from the US, apparently, of Article 5-like guarantees. And Europe is saying it still intends to send in those peacekeeping, stabilization, support troops of some description. But do you think Ukrainian troops are going to feel that the US has their back, and Europe has their back for that matter, if they have to withdraw from the Donbass and go for this sort of DMZ economic free zone idea that's been proposed?
Well, it depends. What time is it? Oh, 11:21 on the East Coast. Well, at 10:45, I was speaking to people in Ukraine in the Ukrainian army. And they absolutely believe we do not have their backs anymore. And in fact, most weapon systems and equipment is not coming from the United States anymore. It comes from Europe. So, people talk about putting in a stabilization force, but that would require that Ukraine agree to giving up 5 or, 4, if we throw in Crimea, 5 provinces to Russia. And as President Zelensky said just a week ago, he has to make a horrific choice between dealing or letting go his largest backer in the Ukrainian war, the United States, or Ukraine's dignity. And if any of you have ever met a Ukrainian, they will not surrender their dignity or sovereignty for a peace deal that the United States thinks is going, not a peace deal, a land swap deal, a real estate deal in which they think the United States is going to surrender 50% of the reconstruction profits, and then start making secret deals with Russia and allow the Russian army to rebuild. When Putin says he's talking about the traditional lands of Ukraine, he means all the way to the Slovenian, Hungarian, and Polish border, every inch of Ukraine. And I would think that Putin sees that there may be some salvation. Having Donald Trump as his supplicant and doing his bidding, he can again try to seem reasonable, knowing that he has no intention of ending this war.
So if there isn't as much trust in the US as there was in Ukraine, is there at least a level of confidence in this idea of European troops going into Ukraine? Is that something that the Ukrainians will be happy about?
No, because what good will it do to have European troops there in a demilitarized zone that is essentially frozen the current battlefield and surrenders Ukrainian territory, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, most of Kherson province, and all of Crimea to Russia? All that allows the Russians to do is rebuild those places, lay out a North Korean style DMZ so that 70 years later they can launch, that no one will ever have that territory again. It surrenders Ukraine and all of its sacrifices to Russia. Look, this is no time, and I'm sure sitting in the Kremlin, Moscow's popping champagne and drinking shots of vodka. But in Kyiv, they are not going to, how can I put it, enjoy a a Neville Chamberlain moment just because the Europeans want peace at Ukraine's expense. That's up to the people of Ukraine. And believe me, they have been taking cruise missile and drone attacks by the hundreds every night for 4 years. So nothing is going to break their will. They know where the bomb shelters are, and they also understand the sacrifice of their soldiers on the battlefield. But again, if that means it's relinquishing or surrendering their sovereignty, capitulating to Moscow, this war will go on for several more years.
And Trump, of course, is still being torn between two conflicts. There's Ukraine, of course, that he wants to try and end, and Venezuela. Just today, actually, Russia has issued a warning saying it would be a fatal mistake to continue the kind of ramping up of pressure on Venezuela, warning that it could have unpredictable consequences for the entire Western Hemisphere. How's Trump likely to read that? I mean, is he interested in backing down because Putin says so?
Look, I just find it fascinating. Every week I do a Substack podcast with Michael Cohen, his lawyer, and Lev Parnas, his former Russia-Ukraine negotiator, which I call Two Felons and a Spy. And we sit and we talk about how Trump makes decisions. And Trump is not cutting a peace deal, and he is not cutting deals with Moscow that are not pre-coordinated. This is a real estate deal. But now that Trump feels that he, in his secret talks with Putin during his Alaska visit, that he has been given complete autonomy to do whatever he wants in the Western Hemisphere. He actually said this 2 weeks ago. It's reestablishing the Monroe Doctrine. Well, the Monroe Doctrine existed before there were real strong sovereign nations who could, in fact, wage a war against us and defeat us in the same way that the Taliban defeated us. Again, I've said this on this program before. We do not do well against people who fight in flip-flops. Everybody in Venezuela is wearing flip-flops. And it's a jungle. We've lost that war before, too. You can go in and take the major cities and seize the oil refineries, but it has a crumbling oil infrastructure that has to survive. You may even be able to knock down Maduro, but that doesn't mean that his lieutenants, deputies, or some of the 100,000 people who support the regime are going to let you sleep at night without your throat slit. I have no earthly idea why Trump is doing this. There is no mandate from the American people to suddenly shift from Ukraine. And if anything, he is talking to Moscow and essentially going to probably promise Moscow that I will get you the deal that you want in Ukraine, but this is now my hemisphere as we agreed. And, Moscow does not have to do business with Maduro. They just like doing business with Maduro. Even though they've sent over some small anti-aircraft missile systems that both Israel and Ukraine have essentially wiped off the face of the earth, knowing America, it's just a small move of a pawn. Moscow has a bigger interest here, and that's the fact that the three largest oil refineries in the United States that can process only heavy crude oil, and the three countries that produce that heavy crude oil are the United States, Venezuela, and Russia. And so I suspect that this is all posturing between Moscow. I think we're going to have a fait accompli. I wouldn't be surprised if our next show is the Ukraine, the invasion of Venezuela special sometime around Christmas, which they think is going to be the Christmas war. They'll be able to get it done from the 24th to the 30th. And he can now say that he fought the Christmas war and won it and restored peace into Venezuela. But Russia doesn't particularly care about that. They care about their region and their influence in Europe and the rest of the world, which Trump has promised. He will bring them back into the G7. He will give them equal footing as China. He will lift all the sanctions and release that $2 trillion of sweet, sweet Russian money, of which he expects to have a cut. So I think Putin is posturing.
Indeed, and business, if there was any still going on between Venezuela and Russia, will get a lot harder, I imagine, after the blockade has been announced by Donald Trump. And we've seen pretty dramatic footage of US forces or US soldiers being dropped onto the decks of tankers, and those tankers being seized. I mean, how complex are those sorts of operations? And does it suggest, a ramping up of capabilities in the Caribbean?
Well, it doesn't suggest a ramping up of capabilities. We've had that capability forever. And if I can be quite sanguine about this, I have seen many more videos of the Yemeni rebels helicopter fast roping onto ships and seizing control of them. I've only seen one American one, and that was the Coast Guard, and that vessel had been sanctioned 4 years ago, so we were ready to get it. In fact, if you notice, this is the next step of the American strategy, which comes in several phases. I've done this operation before against Libya. First thing we do is we announce that they are an international terrorist group. Then we start seizing sanctioned vessels. Not every vessel that comes from from Venezuela. Trump announced they will seize and blockade only sanctioned vessels, which means if someone is a non-sanctioned country, if China starts sending China-flagged vessels there to pick up its heavy crude, which is not the best crude for China, we're not going to be able to stop them unless we want to get into a confrontation. We saw this in the Persian Gulf in 1988, 87, 88, Operation Earnest Will, where we flagged oil tankers going to Kuwait and were daring Iran to attack them. Iran attacked them. They planted mines. So only sanctioned vessels. Next, we're going to start operating so close to the Venezuelan border, within 12 miles. We're going to call this freedom of navigation operations. We're going to try to provoke them. I took part in a major operation in 1985 called Operation Attain Document number 1 through 4. And they were a series of provocation operations that led to a dogfight that led us to attack Libya and try to kill Muammar Gaddafi in Operation Praying Mantis. When you do these things, you got to apply pressure. So we'll probably do freedom of navigation. We'll probably try to provoke the Venezuelan Air Force into a dogfight, which shouldn't be particularly hard. And then we will launch an attack, destroying their air defense, which is not particularly extensive, and maybe land the Marines in Caracas, Venezuela, and the other oil fields, oil transshipment ports. And then we will bring back the former, president or the elected president of Venezuela, and then go into a 20-year war. Because these things never work out when you just do force. Most importantly is there's no authorization for anyone to do any of this. We will have just done what Russia did in Ukraine, invaded a sovereign nation with no provocation on the basis of words that came out of the president's mouth that have no legal authority or heft.
And we've also seen the US has passed its new defense bill, which includes in it a requirement, or there was pressure as part of it for Pete Hegseth to publish all videos of US strikes on alleged drug smuggling boats. He said, I'm not going to do that. Where does this leave the US administration?
Yeah, you and those pesky laws. Who has to maintain those things when you can just ignore them? I found that Pete Hegseth's answer to when he came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee briefing, where he said these videos are classified and we're not going to be releasing any of this information. Well, you blowing that boat up, which you released on the 2nd of September, that wasn't classified. Same aircraft, same weapon systems, same target. It's just that you're showing this time that it's two sailors who are distressed mariners, and you killed them. It will come out at some point. Somebody will go into whistleblower mode. A lot of people were watching, and if I know things, and there will always be one place where one guy has brought a mobile phone into a skiff, and it will be a civilian from the Pentagon, if not Hegseth himself or his buddies, and they will have made a video copy of this, and it'll get out there. All it will show is murder. And it will show that we killed two shipwrecked mariners. God forbid something happened to a U.S. Navy sailor or Marine and they are shipwrecked and they're expecting they're expecting the law of the sea to kick in, and that people will rescue them without just killing them. So I don't think we're going to be seeing anything out of Pete Hegseth anytime soon. But I do look forward to his war crimes trial in the next administration.
And just finally, Malcolm, on that bill, we talked a lot at the start about the US's new national security strategy. The actual bill itself seems to go against a lot of what was laid out in the NSS. It's included several boosts to European security. It says it wants to keep US troops in Europe. Is that going to soothe fears over the role of the US in European defence, that the Congress and Senate perhaps back us, even if the White House doesn't? Or are they being set up here for a bigger battle down the line, do you think?
Well, they're certainly set up for a bigger battle, especially if the House changes next year. Then it's going to be open warfare. The House has the power of the purse. They determine what money gets spent. I mean, they could turn off the Pentagon budget if the United States starts, for example, they do what we call reverse reforger, right? Reforger used to be the operation where we would send divisions of tanks overseas in the event of a Russian invasion or a NATO Article 5 situation. They could send all those ships over there of the, U.S. Sea Lift Command and start bringing out, all of the American service members, while waving a finger at the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. We've already seen the utter lawlessness of this administration. They do not adhere to what has been written in legislation, which are acts of Congress, which are laws. So I think we're looking at a future battle. Trump has always hated Europe. I cannot understand why European leaders keep mollycoddling him. I mean, he thinks that when he went on that visit with the king, and Starmer was there giving him, all of these accolades, that he has them in his pocket now. At some point, Europe is going to have to find a backbone. This is not Franklin Delano Roosevelt who will come to your assistance. This is a guy who is essentially, the new Ribbentrop for Putin's Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement.
Well, Malcolm, it sounds like there'll be much more for us to discuss on this in the future, so hopefully we will speak again soon. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
All right, take care.